How would we live without capitalism? Morning, you open your eyes because you didn't hear the usual alarm notification on your smartphone. You get up and go to the window. Everything is as usual on the street, but there is not a single advertisement anywhere. The eye does not stumble upon a single logo. You go downstairs and go into a coffee shop. They pour you coffee for free. They are happy to see you. Why for free? Because money no longer exists. After all, this world is completely different. But is it better than before? How would you feel if all your training, the entire foundation of knowledge about how the economy should function, was put into your head, but it was not a panacea? What if this is just one of the possible versions of the world order? What if reality is completely different? Philosopher Mark Fisher once said, "It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." Now we're going to break the system and let our imaginations run wild. In this video, we will not just fantasize. We will really try to understand what alternatives there may be to the capitalism we all know. And we will also understand why they are extremely important for us today when society is mired in a consumer race. Capitalism. Agree. Few people are unfamiliar with this word. It has integrated into our society so strongly that we have stopped noticing it, like a fish does not notice the water in which it swims. However, what does it mean? Capitalism is based on three pillars. 1. Private ownership of the means of production. 2. Market economy. 3. The pursuit of profit. It is the third point that is a kind of catalyst for the entire mechanism. We often think that capitalism has always been in our lives, but this is a misconception. It was born in the era of feudalism, matured in the era of mercantilism, when all countries frantically accumulated gold, and it unfolded in all its glory during the Industrial Revolution. Did you know that for most of history, society didn't even know the concept of private property? Show our ancestors today's reality and they'd go crazy. When examining the history of capitalism, one cannot help but mention its anti-heroes and their confrontation. Scottish economist Adam Smith, with his metaphor of the invisible hand of the market, versus Karl Marx, who predicted the death of capitalism due to its contradictions. Milton Friedman, who believed in absolute market freedom, versus John Keynes, who tried to subordinate capitalism to the state. However, how would you behave if you learned that all these bright minds were arguing about something that might not have happened in principle? What if the course of history had turned at a different crossroads and developed according to a completely different scenario? For easier perception, imagine all economic systems as different ecosystems. For example, a tropical forest is no worse or better than a steppe. It is simply a different ecosystem in which its unique species thrive. And in a minute, I will show you that very historical moment when society was at a crossroads and could have chosen a completely different path. Perhaps we will encounter this crossroads again. History remembers periods when literally everything hung by a thread. These periods have their own name, bifurcations. This is exactly the moment when we were at that very crossroads. Let's analyze two moments when society could have completely changed its world. Scenario 1. What would happen if socialist revolutions were to succeed all over the world? 1917. The shot of the aurora, the storming of the Winter Palace. Russia is burning in revolutionary flames. But what if this fire flared up and spread to the borders of the country? What if in Hungary, in Italy, in Germany, they could not extinguish this flame? 1930. The isolated USSR no longer exists. Instead, a huge union of socialist republics would have spread out on the world map. You know what would have been the most interesting thing in this picture? There would have been no external threat a priori, and we would not have known what Stalin's terror and totalitarianism were. Imagine yourself in a new world. Morning, you wake up, open your eyes and look at the ceiling of an apartment that does not belong to a bank, but to a housing cooperative created by the residents themselves. You have breakfast and go to work to produce exactly what you decided. and not to make a profit for someone else, but to satisfy the real needs of the consumer. But this reality scenario is not the only possible one. What if we dig even deeper? Scenario 2. If no one had ever invented money. Sounds radical, wild, impossible? However, in fact, money appeared in history only about 5,000 years ago. Before that, human society got by with forms such as barter or the gift economy. What is a gift economy? It is when a person's status is established not through the prism of his wealth, but through the prism of his generosity. A typical example is the potlatch of the Indians of the northwest coast of America. Everyone saw the status of a chief when he distributed his property to his fellow tribesmen and did not accumulate it. Imagine an amazing world where the most important, respected people, the elite, are not those individuals who have accumulated, collected, appropriated the most, but those who have given the most. Agree that this sounds fantastic. Agree. But even more fantastic is the fact that such societies actually existed, and existed for thousands of years. Now we're going to look at the most exciting part, what our daily lives would be like if we woke up tomorrow in a world that had never heard of capitalism. Prepare to be amazed. Everyday life in alternative realities, labor and employment. Imagine if one morning all the offices disappeared. You no longer know what deadlines, KPIs, and corporate culture are. You no longer have to waste your time to get money. Morning, you wake up yourself because you slept well, and not because you were woken up by a cruel, heartless alarm clock. You go down to the canteen where everyone takes turns being a cook. After that, you work for 4 hours, doing what really captivates you, as anyone, but most importantly, you do it not because of the salary, but simply because you like it. Sounds surreal? Here's a real story you've probably never heard of. Chile, 1971. At that time, the country was ruled by the brilliant President Salvador Allende. That year, he decided to launch a unique project called Cybersyn. In essence, it was the predecessor of the internet, which was charged with managing the economy online. Imagine the room of the future. Huge screens with data, all kinds of remote controls, constant monitoring, analysis, algorithms, etc. In 1973, an American-backed military coup destroyed the project. The chief cameraman was shot dead right at his desk. Now imagine what would have happened if the coup had not happened. Now, let's dive back into our life in an alternative reality. After finishing work, you have an indecently large amount of free time, which you can devote to meetings with loved ones, hobbies, and other creative activities. By the way, back in 1930, the well-known Keynes predicted that by the end of the 20th century, it would be possible to work no more than 15 hours a week. From a technical point of view, this has long been possible. Only the current structure of economic relations does not allow us to switch to such a work week. Consumption and distribution. How would resources be allocated if there were no market price mechanism? In such a world, it would be done very differently. Modern innovations in tandem with artificial intelligence are capable of creating a system that could track the real needs of the consumer and distribute resources much more efficiently than the market. Moreover, the distribution would be not for those who can pay, but for those who really feel the need. Shocking fact. It is enough to know some figures to understand that the problem is not in production, but in distribution. For example, the fact is that today we already produce enough food to feed 10 billion people, but almost 1 billion people are currently starving. How do you like that? There is a local council in your neighborhood. Today, you are solving another pressing issue. You need a new school. Don't have enough materials to build it? No problem. The neighboring neighborhood will gladly exchange them for help with the harvest. Don't have a contractor? No problem. You'll all get together and build it yourselves. Yes, of course, it sounds childishly naive, if not for one but. This is how cathedrals, temples, and traditional houses have been built since ancient times. This is already happening in our world. For example, the Mondragon cooperative in Spain, or the Rochdale cooperative movement in England. Innovations and technologies. The champions of capitalism never tire of repeating that without competition, there would be no innovative technologies. Is this really true? Let's look at your iPhone, which is in your inside pocket. What exactly was created in it by the forces of the market, making it a symbol of unique capitalist technologies? GPS was developed by the military. The touchscreen was created in a government lab. Siri came from a DARPA project, and the internet was invented by scientists who were also funded by the state. Now just imagine that all the geniuses are working on inventing a cure for cancer. And they are working on it not because of the money, but because this medicine will save many people, including this child, because this medicine will be available to everyone in the world. Profit may not be the only motivation. Linux, Wikipedia, scientific cooperation. These examples confirm this statement. Motivation may be, for example, the desire to solve a problem, recognition by society, or even elementary curiosity. If the alternative world is so much better than the real one, why didn't it come into being? What and where deviated? You'll find out about it in just a minute. Global implications, ecology and resources. Have you ever thought of one contradiction? We all know that the life of capitalism is its growth. That is, a company must constantly grow in order to be able to satisfy the needs of its shareholders. For the sake of creating new jobs, the economy must grow. However, what kind of growth can we talk about if we live on a planet with limited resources? It is unrealistic even from a mathematical point of view. In a world without capitalism, the economy would not need to focus on growth. Its priorities would be stability and sustainability. Imagine that success is no longer measured by GDP. In an alternative world, success is measured by environmental well-being, public health, etc. And this is quite realistic. Bhutan has already abandoned GDP measurements. For it, the reality is now the measurement of gross national happiness. Now imagine that the whole world would switch to such measurements. For comparison, imagine your world in 30 years under capitalism, the consequences of cataclysms, floods, drought. In addition, there are wars for resources, migration crises prevail. Now let's imagine an alternative future. Green forests, fragrant fields, clean air, harmony with ecosystems and nature. International relations. It is no secret that modern conflicts are unleashed over resources or markets. The capitalist consequences are obvious. Trade wars, wars for gas and oil. Lives of real people are at stake in order to defend some incomprehensible geopolitical interests. These are children who will never grow up. These are families who will never be together again. In an alternative reality, geopolitical cooperation could be built on different principles. The exchange of resources or technologies instead of threats and sanctions. Unlike capitalism, the alternative system does not end in an inexorable sad ending. It is not doomed. Culture and values. The most profound changes in an alternative world would likely be in culture and cultural values. If measurements were not made in money, society would strive for other ways of self-realization. Imagine a world where creativity was for creativity's sake, where artists didn't have to chase profit, writers didn't have to bend to publishers' demands, and musicians didn't have to adapt to streaming services. Everything would work differently in an alternative reality. Science would be done for the sake of knowledge, not for the sake of patents. Medicine would be aimed at people's health, not at profit for pharmaceutical companies. And who would you be in this new world? What would you do if you made your choices not with your brain and wallet, but with your heart and soul? Conflict and crisis. However, we understand that there is no utopia in which no cataclysms occur. A world without capitalism would also face serious problems. The moment has come for the unpleasant truth. There have been attempts to create an alternative world, but they turned to dust. Thus, the hippie world in the 1960s suffered a defeat due to internal conflicts. As for the Soviet experiment, instead of the desired result, we got authoritarianism. When creating an alternative world, we inevitably face three key questions. 1. How can we determine what and how much to produce without market prices? 2. How to maintain a balance between freedom and centralization? 3. Will everyone work honestly if there is no monetary incentive? Let's simulate a situation. You are a qualified engineer who is working on the implementation of a complex project in an alternative world. At the same time, your colleague is idly spending time while receiving the same amount of benefits as you. How long will you turn a blind eye to this? How long will your motivation last? As real history shows, distribution systems are constantly experiencing difficulties, queues, and shortages appear. Bureaucracy is steadily growing, and society is beginning to divide into classes. A privileged class appears, inequality arises. But progress does not stand still. Technology is constantly evolving. What if it can now cope with all these problems? We can borrow the best from both worlds. Remember the project in Chile? Let's imagine an alternative continuation of this story. The Cybersyn project was not destroyed. By the beginning of the 21st century, artificial intelligence has learned to intelligently allocate resources. Human routine has been replaced by maximum automation. The result is something completely new, different from capitalism or communism, something nurtured by technology. Denouement and conclusions. Perhaps the real alternative is not a categorical rejection of capitalism, but its radical transformation. At the moment, in our reality, there are some fragments of post-capitalism, open-source systems, experiments with universal basic income, Mondragon in Spain, Wikipedia. If you imagine capitalism, it will be an exclusively economic model that exists as long as you do something for it, run, work, spin. As for the alternative system, it is a fundamentally different way of life. It is life in the mountains and walks along the coast. How does a sober look at an alternative world help us now? It helps us assess the situation we live in. It helps us see some things that may shock us, such as the horrific inequality, when 1% of society owns more wealth than the other 99%. The main question is the question of choosing between abstract realities. The main question is what kind of world we and our children want to live in. What will be our priorities? What values? The true wealth of any nation is not the amount of wealth in its vaults. True wealth is measured by the happiness of its citizens, the depth of its culture, the justice of its laws, and the purity of its nature. I won't believe you if you say you wouldn't like to live in such an alternative world. What would you like to change in our reality today? Maybe you are already changing something? Share it with us in the comments. Let's change the world together. Remember the most important thing. Our present is not a finished result. It develops and changes thanks to our actions, so we can always achieve an alternative world. If this video has stirred your emotions, made you think about many things, share it with your family, loved ones, and friends. Subscribe to the channel to continue exploring possible alternative paths for all of humanity with us.